killing deer, saving deer?
What the heck? Yeah, no, I know.
Hey folks, welcome to Eastmans Hunting Journal Podcast edition. I'm Ike Eastman, your host, and today I have an unbelievably intelligent human being, one of the smartest I've ever been around, Dr. Kevin Monteith, who is, not only is he a taxidermist, not only is he a hunter, but he's also a scientist, and he's been studying ungulates, specifically deer, and most recently mule deer, for the better part of 2 decades.
Yeah, I got my degree from Idaho State, but my work was all on mule deer in the Sierra Nevadas of California.
Okay.
Yep.
So what was your, I guess, PhD? What was your thesis, or what were you trying to prove?
Yeah. So for my PhD, I had the opportunity to jump in at the tail end of a long-term research project where they'd been monitoring migratory deer and looking at it from a nutritional perspective. And so fairly novel approach to catching animals twice a year, measuring condition, reproduction, and then monitoring reproduction, role of nutrition, role of the environment, role of predators within that system. And so
pretty much everything you're doing now.
Yeah, and then we've just like taken it one additional layer. And so science is so incremental. And so even when you look at like what we did there and then what we're doing now, it's just been increment after increment after increment of gaining new information, standing on that foundation. And then what's the next piece that's going to help us appreciate things further. And it was in that work in particular that sort of grounded the foundation even further of the importance of nutrition, the importance of body fat for these animals, and then what that means for the capacity of the landscape to support a population. So the ideas of carrying capacity, and then also how we think about role of predation within systems as well. And so it was migratory deer population occupied either side of the Sierra Crest, which that did 2 things that were fairly convenient in helping understand mule deer big picture. Way more because of the rain shadow, way more moisture on the west side, very, very dry on the east side, so very different nutritional regime.
Yeah, because you think of Nevada versus California.
Exactly. And so way wet on the west side, relatively wet on the west side, dry on the east side, which puts them in a different nutritional playing field depending upon where they migrated to. Mm-hmm. They all wintered on the east side. But then what we also had is very different predation pressure as well. Very high density bears on the west side, very light pressure from bears on the east side. So basically from that, it yielded this scenario where we had good nutrition on the west side, which should have yielded greater capacity for reproduction, survival, and growth. But bears were largely responsible for why the western component of the migratory segment of that population had declined for the past 2 decades. And so that did not ally with the nutrition that those animals were obtaining compared with the east side. And so the east side were just kind of hanging on, and the west side was declining, but is largely attributed to bear predation that they were experiencing on summer range. Impressive amount of bear predation on fawns.
And that's something you don't hear about every day. A scientist going, it's predation.
Predation. Yeah, you don't. And it's the, within that realm. And, I think, I'm a hunter myself. And so like, our hunter constituents and the folks that we interact with, I often say, like, I may be a scientist, but those are my people, right? And so it's like, I get it, and it's an easy thing to think that, you have something with canines on the landscape, and they're killing some of, our deer that we value having there. So let's get rid of the canines on the landscape, so then we have more deer. It's a nice way to think about it, and it's intuitive, right?
Right.
It's not that simple, but it doesn't mean predators never have an effect, right? Nutrition is the foundation, and if they don't have the resources to grow, deer, most animals, they'll put more young on the landscape than the landscape can support. And so if some of those die of malnutrition or some of them go to predation, it doesn't matter. It's when we cross that level beyond that where predation exceeds the capacity of our landscape to support those animals. And that's what was happening in the Sierras.
But you said something to me that's really interesting. You said something about the 17-18 winter, mm-hmm. and that die-off, which was 30%, right, mm-hmm. was what kept us from losing all our deer mm-hmm. in 22, 23. What in the hell are you talking about?
Yeah,
killing deer, saving deer?
What the heck? Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, and this, There's an element here, big picture, where I think we as humans, right, more is always better, right?
Yeah.
So keep that concept in mind while we basically tell the story of the Wyoming Range mule deer herd since we began in 2013. And so as we measure body fat seasonally, body fat is something that's essential for the animal to survive and reproduce as it crosses seasons, and we've highlighted that a bit especially with regards to winter survival. Body fat is also, here's where I want to say redneck thinking, because we can go in, we can measure habitat, we can do all these different things, but we have to know what is important on the ground already to be able to know what to measure and then be able to understand what that means for the animal. But the animal is influenced by all kinds of different things, right? And oftentimes we can measure the right things, but it's really hard and tricky. And so I often say, maybe I'm just simple-minded, but I cheat and I let the animal integrate its environment for us. And the way it does that is by way of body fat. So all else being equal, an animal that has more and better food is going to be fatter than an animal that has lower quality and less food. So why not use that as the key integrator to what it means for that animal? And so it's incredible power to be able to look backwards to what it experienced and then be able to look forward, because it has groceries on its back that it's taken with it into that next season. There's a lot of power in that. And so what we've seen is we started in 2013, and then we saw as you expect, deer gain fat over the summer, they lose fat over the winter, and we see this cycle. That cycle is important. It's part of the pre-programming how these animals work. But what's more important is what levels they're hitting based on what they're going through. And when we saw them December 2013, and that as we progressed for the following years leading into the 16-17 winter, so in December 2016, we basically started at roughly 11% December 2013, and then each year we just saw this progressive decline to about 7.5% body fat leading into the 16-17 winter. It's not like we were having wild years of fawn recruitment. It's not like the environmental conditions were really poor.
It's not like we were in a giant drought that the high country dried up.
No, it's just okay right. Years, right? But we just incrementally saw that go down each year, which to us, it's hard to paint this picture super strongly, but to us that was in only a few years, but it was a very strong indicator that we were bumping up against the capacity of that habitat. Maybe roughly 35,000 deer, given the landscape conditions, given where deer were living, we were probably bumping up against that. We enter the 16-17 winter. It's a bad winter. We lost 30% of our deer population in the 16-17 winter. And that also what spurred, fortunately, our effort to continue working to see what recovery looks like after a winter like that. We saw amazing bump in body fat after that, a substantial recovery in body fat after the 16-17 winter, certainly the moisture, the reduction in density. And then we already bumped up against the 18-19 winter. So even though our goals were to see what recovery looked like, we bump up against the 18-19 winter again, we lose 30% again. And then
even though the body fat was back to somewhat normal.
That's right. Exactly. And so two hits right within that window of time. We saw a little bit of recovery after 16-17 with regards to population growth, with regards to body fat, and then another 30% reduction. And then since then, if you can imagine, each time we go into the 16-17 winter, we begin to what we would call at least breaking records relative to our data run with regards to nutritional condition and how fat they were. We began to break records 16-17. We hit 18-19. We began to break records again with regards to that. And then they largely maintained those higher levels of body fat thereafter. And then as no one could have predicted, then we begin to bump up against the 22-23 winter. When we entered the 22-23 winter in December, we were over 11% body fat. So remember, we were at about 7% body fat going into the 16-17. We were at 11% body fat going into the 22-23 winter. And we knew from all the work that we'd done, some of the work we did with Taylor Lashar, the reason they were fatter there is multifold, but one of the primary reasons they were fatter, we had fewer mouths to feed on the landscape. So that's that density-dependent response, right? We're seeing the improved condition because of that. Moisture plays a big role. So when you get moisture on summer range, and what we've termed the notion of winter PTSD, and that is when when these deer have experienced these life-threatening events, we see this like subtle reprogramming in how they allocate resources and body fat through the year.
Really?
Yeah, and so even after we account for all of these environmental conditions like the reduction in density, like moisture, like fawn recruitment and reproductive effort, we still see a signal of if animals have been through bad winter, we see that signal play out in how much fat they gain through the summer, which seems wild, right?
Yeah.
But here's the thing. If you consider deer in multiple different landscapes, depending upon the productivity, depending upon the severity of the winters, they don't all accrue and lose fat like deer in the Wyoming Range. The deer in the Sierra Nevadas do not accrue and lose fat like deer in the Wyoming Range do.
It's not so
Why?
drastic.
Because it's a different system. The summer range is much drier, not near as productive as the Wyoming Range, but winter severity almost isn't a thing.
Mm-hmm.
They can come into winter with not a lot of fat, and they can make it through the winter. What they do need in the Sierra is perhaps a bit more than we need in the Wyoming Range, is they need to finish winter at a higher fat level because they need it to invest in reproduction. In the Wyoming Range, that level is a bit lower because they're going to places with incredible resources. They need some for sure, but they're going to places with incredible resources. So now if you think about adaptability of an animal over a long period of time, and part of what led us to this idea is some work that they did with semi-domesticated reindeer in Norway, where they took them from like supplementally fed area and then basically reduced their supplemental feed, put them in a nutritionally stressful situation. Females immediately adapted to basically preserving themselves over investment in their young.
Really?
Because of those experiences, because they're coming from that place and they're basically carrying that with them because ultimately they need to survive. Well, if these females don't survive winters, they don't stand a chance.
Right.
So if they're not accruing enough fat, they don't stand a chance. So we're seeing this, it's sort of like the animals adapting to that environment as it changes in those like severely drastic ways. So all those things play into us seeing those animals as 11% going into the 22-23 winter. And then we lost 70% of our adult females through the course of that winter. Super knockdown, drag out, bad winter, right? Had we, based on all of our survival models and the conditions that we experienced, had those animals entered the 22-23 winter at 7% body fat like they did going into the 16-17 winter, we would have survived less than 10% of our population.
Maybe none of them.
Maybe none of them, because there's no way they had the resources to persist through and allow them to persist that long through that bad of a winter. Which means that the 16-17, the 18-19, the thwack that it did to population abundance. Remember I said the concept of more is always better. More was not better, especially as we prepared and didn't know it was coming, the 22-23 winter. And so it's those two winters and the hit on the population during those times, the recovery and nutritional condition that we saw, that set them up to be able to do as well as they did going into the 22-23 winter. Now it even gets more remarkable after that, and we still have more to learn. But we again broke records of body condition. So we make our figures of seeing, this fluctuation over time, and we keep having to move the y-axis because our data points don't fit in it anymore.
Really?
Because they're so impressively fat after these windows of time, because they're reaping the benefits of the moisture, they're reaping the benefits of the lower competition on the landscape, and we're seeing these boosts that occur thereafter. And I think what's so incredible, and so now, this summer wasn't the best summer with regards to growth conditions. It dried up very fast. It was pretty dry, and yet our animals were still impressively fat. Some of the fattest we've ever seen them going into this winter. As we finished this winter, and admittedly, we're almost past the winter, but we catch them in mid-March. When we saw our adult females in mid-March, they were at 7% body fat at the end of the winter.
Still?
At the end of the winter at 7% body fat. And remember, we started the 16-17 winter, so coming off a summer range, at 7%. Here we're finishing winter at 7%. There we began winter at 7%. Wow. So we're in a completely different situation now because of the bad winters that we've had. And the animals that remain there are robust, they're fat, they have lots of resources to them at this point in time.
Okay, so now I'm going to take it one step, the next step. because of bad winters, because of 16, 17, and the bad winters created moisture, and it created less, mouths at the table, which created more groceries, more food on the table. And you don't know this, but I'll bet you guys are going to find out, is the reverse possible as well, where these more mild winters aren't going to create the groceries, which then allow, they may be at 7% body fat now, but if they don't get the groceries, the moisture in the summer, it creates the opposite, and where they come in at 8-9% this fall.
Yeah.
Because we had a mild winter.
It's all going to play into that. I mean, precip, whether you consider precip that grows food during the summer or the precip that we get during the winter and how that affects them with regards to winter severity, is a very important driver within this system as well. All these things, and as we often we want to point to the one thing. The thing is, all of these things come into play.
Now let's talk about big bucks. So let me ask you this. So we had a bad winter of 22, 23. We had a mild winter of 24, 25. So these fawns that are in utero right now, they are going to be signatured, or what do you call it, signaled?
Yep.
To where they have good nutrition. Because these, you told us earlier that these does right now, you guys got done capturing them, they're coming out of the winter, almost out of the winter at 12%.
7%. Out of the winter at 7%. That's right.
Which is, that's absolutely
crazy.
insane.
Yeah.
So these fawns that are killed, or they're born in 25, when they're 5, when they're at mature buck age, which will be in 2030, they're significantly going to be body size bigger and antler growth size. So you could time, if I had tags and points, you could time when you wanted to put in to maximize trophy size.
To hit the cohorts when conditions and nutrition were right for mom, that's going to lead to that pathway of recovery. And even the ones born this past year, we were in a good condition. We had impressive fawn survival. Those cohorts of animals should be better than average because they should be expressing their genetic potential, because it's called the silver spoon effect. Mom was able to give them the silver spoon. They got a good start on life. They're on that trajectory to express it. And the flip of that is we have, again, right, we struggle within these bad winters of even fawn surviving, but we had one in particular, and it's actually the sibling to the daughter's story that I told you about that gave birth on the same day as her mom. It's actually her brother, but they were born following the 16-17 winter. Bad winter. Fawn survival was terrible that summer. Their mom was impressive. She amazingly pulled it off, but she carried the mark, and they carried the mark of that bad winter with them. Him as a 3-year-old, he looked like a big yearling.
Really?
Yeah, and admittedly, it's one animal, right? But we've seen it in others as well. But to me, it's of course. He was born after that bad winter. Mom was barely hanging on, and he carried that signature with him through his whole life. And, he's small to the level of, not even just subtly below average. So
that's funny. We were hunting, I don't know, 20 years ago. Let's say 20 years ago, we were in Montana. And we see this really nice mule deer buck, but he's by himself. And the hunt winner shoots him, and we walk up, and he's a dwarf. He looked like a 180 mule deer. We walk up to him, he's 120. Okay. Everything was small. He was like the size of a dog. He was a runt, probably born in a bad winter.
Most likely, yeah, exactly.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
So you could time. Pay attention. You could time your points if it all worked out to maximize antler growth in some of these areas based on the winter that deer was born.
Yeah.
Even if you're not planning on hunting, buy a tag, because that money goes, right to the ground. We're self-funded here in Wyoming. Just make sure that even if you're like, hey, I don't have the money resources, get out there, help a fencing project, get out there and help plant some sagebrush. Donate some time I assume you guys use volunteers for stuff.
We do.
So donate your time. I appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.